Good morning and welcome to Mornings with Me. I got my tea in my nondescript mug. And today I want to address what is a fiscal crisis and when does it actually occur. I'm actually going to start with something odd. Um, let's see if I can get this well. So this is a very famous cover picture from Isaac Asimov's classic sci-fi novel, Foundation. The character being shown here is Harry Selden, and there's a very special kind of plot point event that occurs multiple times throughout the entire series called a Selden Crisis. Specifically, a Selden Crisis in the book itself is a point at which all options have been constrained. So the concept behind Foundation is that Harry Selden created the science of psychohistory, where he foretells the fall of the Galactic Empire and that there would be like a 10,000 year dark ages unless he sets up this foundation on this very far out planet called Terminus. And they have a foundation, the Encyclopedia Foundation. So supposedly they're putting together a galactic encyclopedia, but it turns out that's bogus. Shh, spoiler. But yeah, this book is decades old. That's not the biggest spoiler that the Foundation project is totally bogus. But Selden crises come up time and again in the series, and the point is that they kind of drift along until they can't drift along anymore and they come to a crisis point. And what's good about this, and so I'm looking up the definition of the word crisis, and it does come from Greek originally. So let me explain the Greek from the ancient Greek, and then I'm not going to try to pronounce ancient Greek, it is just crisis. Meaning a separating power of distinguishing decision, choice, election, judgment, dispute, coming from an older word, krino, to pick out, choose, decide, or judge. So it's about decisions. In the Selden crisis, basically, there are no decisions that can be made. Once you get to the Selden crisis, there's essentially only one way out, and that is the fictional trope there. So let's look at the definition for crisis: a crucial or decisive point or situation, a turning point. Number two, an unstable situation in political, social, economic, or military affairs, especially one involving an impending abrupt change. And then there's some others that have to do with more technical terms with regards to medicine, so I'm not going to cover those. So the issue with crisis and fiscal crisis, I am put to mind Meredith Whitney's prediction, and I think it was back in 2010, about all of these municipal bankruptcies were going to occur, and you had a lot of defaults on municipal bonds, etc. Of course, this did not occur. We just had Detroit. That was really and then we had San Bernardino and Stockton. And those were the only major bankruptcies, per se, that have occurred since then. So why did she get it so wrong? And it's not because she was stupid. It was outside her realm of expertise. She was, her expertise, if I remember correctly, was corporate bonds. And the way corporates default is very different from how governments default. And that's how she got the timing wrong. So when does a political, governmental fiscal crisis occur? Basically, when they can't do any of their clever tricks anymore. Now, what's interesting is, unlike with corporate defaults and corporate crises, which are destructive enough economically, but the world doesn't end. Companies go bankrupt all the time. Okay, it happens. There are procedures in court to, get things. To get things back into an orderly way, see what you can actually pay off. Sometimes you actually just have to entirely liquidate the holdings. There's nothing really that can be salvaged. That's a possibility coming out of corporate bankruptcy. But what about a municipality? What about a state? What about a nation? So, now's the next story, French Revolution. And this is actually not the French Revolution per se, but the run-up to the French Revolution. It had its origins, actually, if I want to really get into it, it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, but it really starts with Louis XIV. And so that's like a couple, well, like 150 years before. Louis XIV was very, very war happy. And as you can imagine, this put a very heavy fiscal crunch on France. So he had various finance ministers who came up with clever ideas to provide funding to the French nation. And one of these was tontines, and I'm not going to get into the details of this. It'll be in the blog post. And the first set of tontines, a special, well, kind of an annuity, were well developed, well managed. They actually paid out completely and were not necessarily a drag on France's finances. However, they kept getting, progressively more desperate, and it was kind of, kind of how the U.S. beat the Soviet Union. We outspent them, and they had a fiscal collapse. But going back to France, there was the 7 Years' War, which I think it's the 7 Years' War, which we know as the French and Indian War in America. And then, of course, the American Revolution, which the French really helped finance. And so they kept coming up with these progressively more insane ways to finance their operations. This did lead up to the French Revolution, and there was more than just money involved. But when you have a basically fiscal collapse, and a big part of it wasn't just these clever ideas, but also that the richest people, the aristocrats, the French church, were exempt from basically all taxes. And they're the ones who actually owned most of the land and everything, and they're not paying taxes. And so you are imposing taxes on some of the people who least could afford it. And there was also an agricultural crisis the year of the French Revolution. So anyway, lots of crises. So where am I going with this? Oh, okay. We have the idea of a crisis. This came up with a lot of the discussions over Medicare and Social Security this week. And I saw two articles after I had posted my piece on Social Security, one by Megan McArdle at the Washington Post, and one was an interview with the ex-CEO, or I don't remember if it's July 1st when he's actually retiring, of Starbucks. Megan McArdle basically says, well, yeah, we didn't learn anything new, and it's true, even though, say, the Medicare trust fund running out 3 years earlier is kind of a bit of news. Social Security, we've known that the trust fund is going to run out for decades. This is not a surprise. There is no crisis per se because we are not at the point where the politicians are forced to do something. The reason the trust fund running out is a real crisis in a political sense is the current law is set up to automatically pay Social Security benefits until the trust fund runs out, at which point there will be an across-the-board cut. Actually, I'm not sure if it says like a level percent or they can prorate it or something like that. That's possible. I'm not sure. It'll be about a 21% cut based on current numbers. The amount of the cut has gone up and down projected. So we'll see. And the point is, at that point, the politicians will be forced to act. That's a crisis, when they actually are forced to do something. And they will be forced. This happens all the time with Medicare. There's always these Medicare cuts that are written into budget bills. And it's, of course, unpopular to cut this very broad-based entitlement. So Congress keeps making fixes. So they are being forced to act. Now, obviously, this is not really a crisis. But the point at which, say, governments run into crisis is basically when They can no longer borrow money. Um, or the cash flows dry up. And almost none of these are surprises. The problem is, unlike with a corporation, which can cut its losses much before you run out of money entirely, generally that's what it takes for a government because there's no political will. Oh, I'm sorry. And the interview with Schultz was about all of these grand ideas for like Medicare for all or jobs for all, like the Civilian Conservation Corps that my granddaddy was in during the Depression. How are we going to pay for all of this? At a certain point, the money runs out. Social Security started being a problem in 2010 because it's the money is running out. It's the cash flows. Um, but it wasn't a crisis. It was a problem, but it only becomes a crisis because they're not making a little bit of a political difficult decisions now versus when it's going to be catastrophic. And unfortunately, the way politics are now, and this is not unique to the US, it's going to require the money running out. So, have a good weekend, or have a good next week, and see you next week.